Jake Harper wiped the sweat from his brow as he stood in the middle of his farm, staring out at the endless horizon. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows over the rolling fields of wheat. To anyone passing by, Jake looked like just another quiet, hard-working farmer. A man who'd spent his life in the dirt, planting seeds and pulling weeds. But what no one knew, not even the locals who waved at him as they passed, was that Jake had once been someone else entirely. A man who had seen things and done things that most people couldn't even imagine. Now in his late 40s, Jake lived a simple life. The military, with all its chaos and danger, was behind him. But the weight of it never quite left. The scars, both mental and physical, were something he carried every day. Some nights, he would wake up in a cold sweat, hearing gunshots echo in his mind. But today was a good day. The crops were healthy, the animals were well fed, and there was a slight breeze that made the work just a little bit easier. He had no complaints. That was until the black SUV pulled up to his farm. Hello, Mr. Pictures here. And before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. Jake had been working with his back to the road, but the sound of the engine was unmistakable, deep, throaty, and aggressive. He turned around, his eyes narrowing instinctively. 4 men stepped out of the SUV, their movements deliberate, their expressions cold. Their clothes were too clean for the rough rural town of Oak Ridge. They looked out of place. One of them, the tallest of the group, approached Jake. He wasn't smiling, neither was anyone else. "You're Jake Harper?" he asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the stillness of the land. Jake didn't answer immediately. He wiped his hands on his jeans and took a slow breath. He could feel the tension in the air, like something was off. This wasn't a friendly visit. "That's me," Jake replied, his voice steady. The man didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're with the Cartel," he said, the words heavy in the air. "And we've come to talk about a business proposition." Jake's pulse barely quickened. He had seen all sorts of people in his time, men who thought they could take whatever they wanted. Cartels weren't new to him. He had been in enough places in the world to know the signs when something dangerous was coming. But no one in Oak Ridge had ever had the nerve to try something like this before. The man continued, his eyes scanning the farm like it was something to be claimed. "We've got operations nearby, and your farm is in our way. We can make things easier for you, protect your land, keep your business running smoothly, but you'll need to pay for our protection. Understand?" Jake's hand instinctively moved to his side, where his old pocket knife was tucked away. But he stopped himself. These men had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't know what kind of man had once lived here, what kind of training he had. They thought he was just a farmer. They were wrong. "Protection?" Jake repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I've been running this farm for over 20 years. I don't need any help from people like you." The man's expression hardened, but he wasn't surprised. "You'll change your mind when we come back. We expect a payment in full by the end of the week. If not, well, we'll make sure you regret it." Jake didn't flinch. He had seen men like this before. Bullies, criminals who thought they could intimidate anyone into submission. But Jake had lived through far worse. They had no idea what he was capable of. The leader of the group nodded at his men, and they turned, heading back to the SUV. Jake stood motionless, watching them go. The engine roared to life, and the men disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Jake alone with the weight of their words. Jake stood there for a moment, considering the situation. The cartel was operating in his town now. The thought sent a cold chill through his veins. He wasn't afraid of them, not at all. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be the last time they came around. And the next time they came, they would learn exactly who they were dealing with. Jake stood at the edge of the field, staring down the long dirt road where the cartel's black SUV had disappeared. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, and for a brief moment, it felt like any other evening. But deep down, Jake knew it wasn't. The world had just shifted in a way that he couldn't ignore, and it had come for his farm, the one thing he had left after everything. The old familiar weight of his military training stirred in the pit of his stomach. Years of quiet reflection on the farm had dulled his senses. But this felt like something he couldn't just let go. The cartel might have underestimated him, thought they were dealing with an easy target, but they didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he had done, the things he had survived, the wars he had fought. Jake had been a Green Beret for most of his life. He had been trained for covert operations, stealth missions, and survival in the most extreme environments. He had spent countless nights in hostile territories, facing off against enemies far more dangerous than these men. And now, in the quiet of his farm, he found himself preparing for the same kind of battle. He turned back toward the farmhouse, walking slowly as he ran through his options. He wasn't one to start trouble, but Jake had learned long ago that if someone came for your land, your livelihood, you had to fight back. It was the only way to survive. He pulled out his old pocket knife and slipped it into his belt. It was simple, unassuming, but it had served him well in tight situations. Jake walked into the barn and stood by the far wall, running his fingers over the tools that had kept him working for all these years. He picked up the old rifle his father had given him, the one that had been handed down for generations. The barrel was cold, the wood worn from use, but it still felt like home in his hands. It wasn't just a rifle, it was a symbol of everything he had protected over the years. His family, his land, his freedom. As Jake loaded the rifle, he thought about the cartel's leader, Rico. The man had spoken with such ease, expecting Jake to fall in line, to pay the extortion money like so many others had. But Jake wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid of men with guns or threats. He had been to war, and in war, there were no guarantees. He knew how to strike fast, how to turn the tables, and that's exactly what he planned to do. The night was closing in fast, and Jake's mind raced with plans. He knew that the cartel wasn't going to back off. Rico had made it clear that they would come back, that their protection would cost him. But Jake wasn't interested in paying for something he didn't need. He spent the next few hours preparing, setting up traps, and mapping out the land around his farm. He knew the terrain better than anyone, and he wasn't going to give up without a fight. As the last sliver of daylight faded into twilight, Jake stood on the porch of his farmhouse, his rifle at his side, his eyes scanning the horizon. It wasn't long before he heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. The black SUV was back, just like he knew they would be. The engine hummed as it pulled into his driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Jake stood tall, unflinching, as the vehicle came to a stop. The door opened and Rico stepped out, flanked by two of his men. "I figured you'd be ready for us," Rico said with a smirk, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. "But I didn't think you'd be this prepared." Jake didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, his posture calm, the weight of his rifle resting against his shoulder. Rico took a few steps closer, the two cartel men flanking him. But there was a change in the air now. Jake's presence was undeniable. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. "You came to the wrong place," Jake finally said, his voice low and steady. "I don't want your protection, and I don't need it. So I suggest you turn around and leave before things get ugly." Rico chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it now. "You think you can take us on, old man? You're just a washed-up soldier. You don't stand a chance." Jake's eyes narrowed, his finger brushing the trigger of his rifle. He wasn't trying to start a war, but he wasn't going to let these men threaten him without consequences. "I've killed men like you before," he said quietly, his voice unwavering, "and I'll do it again if I have to." Rico's grin faded slightly as he looked at the rifle, the weight of Jake's words settling in. He wasn't sure whether Jake was bluffing or if this farmer really had the skill to back up his threat. But he wasn't about to let his pride show weakness. "I think you're making a big mistake," Rico said, his voice hard. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," Jake replied, his voice calm and even. "And you don't have a clue who I am." There was a long, tense silence as the two men sized each other up. The night air was still, the only sound the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Jake had been in this situation before, facing enemies who thought they had the upper hand. But this time, it was different. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had something worth protecting, his home, his family, his peace, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. Rico looked to his men, nodding for them to approach, but Jake was faster. His rifle came up with practiced ease, and in one smooth motion, he fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the ground just in front of the cartel's feet. The men froze, their hands instinctively reaching for their guns, but Jake was already several steps ahead. He knew they wouldn't back down without a fight, but he wasn't interested in killing them, not yet. "Get the hell off my property," Jake said, his voice deadly calm. "This is your last warning." For a moment, the cartel men hesitated, unsure of how to respond. They had come expecting an easy win, expecting to intimidate a helpless farmer into submission. What they hadn't counted on was a trained Green Beret with the resolve to stand his ground. Rico finally took a step back, his face flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Harper," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "We'll be back." Jake didn't flinch. "Next time, I won't give you a chance to leave." The cartel men hesitated one last time before they turned and retreated back to their SUV. Jake watched them leave, the tension still hanging in the air, but he didn't lower his rifle. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not yet. As the vehicle disappeared down the road, Jake exhaled slowly, his muscles still tense. He had sent them a message, but the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jake turned and walked back to his farmhouse, the weight of his rifle still heavy in his hands. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a man who had been pushed to his limit, and he had shown the cartel that they had made a grave mistake. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sun was barely up when Jake woke the next morning, the sharp sting of adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He didn't sleep much anymore, not after the cartel had come to his door. The night had felt like a warning, a brush with danger that he knew would only escalate. The quiet of his farm, the stillness of the land he loved so much, had been shattered. It wasn't going to be easy to put things back to normal. He rose from bed and stretched, his body sore from the strain of the night before. It wasn't just his muscles that ached. It was the reminder that his peaceful life had come to an end. The cartel was not going to walk away quietly, not when they had been humiliated like this. They had underestimated him, but that didn't mean they wouldn't come back with more force. It meant they'd be more dangerous. Jake wasn't naive. He knew that next time, they wouldn't just try to scare him. They would make it personal. They would come with everything they had. But Jake had been through worse. He had fought battles that left scars across countries, across continents. This was his fight, his land, and he would die before he let anyone take it from him. He made his way downstairs to the kitchen, his boots quiet on the wooden floors. The smell of coffee filled the air as he poured himself a cup, the warmth of it grounding him, calming his nerves. He couldn't afford to get careless, to make rash decisions. Every move had to be precise, calculated. He knew the cartel wasn't going to back down, and he needed to be ready. But Jake wasn't just going to sit and wait for them to come to him again. He had to take the fight to them before they had a chance to escalate things further. He walked out the back door and into the early morning light, the dew still heavy on the grass. His farm stretched out before him, rows of crops that were healthy, thriving under his careful hand. For the first time since the encounter, Jake felt a pang of pride. This land had been his for decades, handed down through generations. His family had worked it, fought for it, and it would remain his, come hell or high water. Jake made a mental list of the supplies he needed, the traps he could set, the measures he could take to ensure his farm's safety. He had lived through covert operations, been deep in enemy territory, and had been the last man standing when everyone else had been wiped out. He knew the land, knew how to blend in with the shadows, and he could use the same stealth tactics here. The farm would be his stronghold, and he would protect it with everything he had. By mid-afternoon, he had his plan in motion. He had set up a perimeter around the farm, hidden traps, made sure all the vehicles were in place, and prepared the rifle. He wasn't taking any chances. He would be ready for them. As the sky began to darken, Jake heard the familiar sound of an engine in the distance. It was too early for the cartel to return, too soon for them to be making their move. But the sound grew louder, closer. Jake's instincts went on high alert. He crouched low behind the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. The SUV was back. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved like a shadow, silently, his movements precise as he took cover behind a stack of hay bales. He didn't need to see them. He could hear them. He could feel their presence. His hands were steady as he pulled his rifle into position, the cool metal of the barrel against his shoulder as he peered through the scope. The cartel's SUV stopped just beyond the tree line, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a spotlight. He could hear their voices, the low murmurs of Rico and his men. They were coming closer, unaware of the trap Jake had set. They thought they could just walk onto his land again, demand money, force him to comply. But this time, they weren't going to find the same Jake who had been passive the first time. Jake's eyes narrowed as he adjusted the sight. One shot. That was all it would take to send a message. He wasn't going to let them get close enough to make demands. They needed to know that this was his farm, and they weren't welcome here. Through the scope, he could see them moving, positioning themselves like they thought they were invisible. They had no idea what they were walking into. Rico was the first to step out of the SUV, the smug confidence back on his face. But that confidence faltered when he saw the movement in the shadows. Jake squeezed the trigger. The sound of the shot was deafening in the quiet night, a sharp crack that sent a ripple through the air. Rico's head jerked back, and he collapsed to the ground in a heap, blood pooling on the dirt. His men froze, scrambling for cover, but they had no chance. Jake was already moving, repositioning himself, using the land he knew so well to his advantage. The next shot took out the closest man. Another one dropped to the ground with a grunt, his weapon slipping from his fingers. The remaining men, realizing they were under attack, tried to scatter. But it was too late. Jake's movements were precise, honed from years of training. He picked them off one by one, each shot echoing in the still night. The last man, the youngest of the group, tried to flee, but Jake had already anticipated it. With a quick motion, he took him down, the rifle scope lining up perfectly for the kill shot. When the dust settled, Jake stood alone, surrounded by the bodies of the cartel members he had taken down. The farm was still his, but it hadn't been easy. The quiet of the night returned, but this time, Jake's heart was still racing. He knew this wasn't the end. They would be back, more of them, angrier and more determined. The cartel wouldn't just give up because they had lost a few men, but Jake had sent them a message tonight. This farm was his, and he would defend it with his life. He slowly lowered his rifle and walked to where Rico's body lay. The cartel leader was dead, his eyes wide in surprise. But Jake had no time for regrets, no time to mourn. He needed to make sure the town knew what had happened, that this was over, for now. He checked his rifle and made his way back toward the farmhouse, the weight of what he had done settling on his shoulders. Jake wasn't just a farmer, he was a soldier again, a warrior protecting the land he loved, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. Jake stood in the fading light, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he walked toward the farmhouse. His hand gripped the rifle, the weight of it still heavy in his arms, but his movements were steady. The shots had been clean, each one finding its mark with precision, the way he had been trained to do. But even as the cartel men lay sprawled across the dirt, their lives taken in the blink of an eye, Jake felt no sense of victory. There was no satisfaction in ending their lives, only a cold, hollow realization that this was far from over. He reached the farmhouse and set the rifle down on the porch, his fingers brushing the wood of the door as he had opened it. The house was still and silent inside, the familiar smell of old wood and earth clinging to the walls. It had always been a place of comfort, of peace. But now, it felt more like a battlefield, a place where violence had come uninvited, and the echoes of it still hung in the air. Jake moved inside, his eyes scanning the room for any sign that the fight had come to his doorstep. But everything was as it should be. The kitchen was neat, the stove unused for the day. He passed the old photo of his parents on the mantel, their smiles frozen in time, reminding him of how far he had come. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he had been young, ready to take on the world. But that world had changed. The world he had once fought in, the one where the rules were clear and the enemy was easy to identify, had bled into this quiet farm life, dragging its chaos with it. He took a seat at the table, the chair creaking beneath his weight. He poured himself a glass of water, his mind racing. The cartel wasn't done. They would send more men, maybe even more than before. They were a huge organization, one that spanned far beyond this small town. And Jake knew that one victory didn't erase the target on his back. He had killed their leader, Rico, and in doing so, had sent a message. But it was a message that wouldn't be taken lightly. The door creaked behind him, and Jake turned, instinctively reaching for his rifle before he realized it was just Maggie, the local sheriff. She had been a good friend over the years, someone who had always respected his quiet ways. She stepped inside, her eyes immediately going to the rifle resting by the door. Her expression hardened as she looked at Jake. "I heard the shots," she said, her voice steady, but there was concern underneath. "What happened, Jake?" Jake stood, his movements slow, as he reached for the glass of water on the table. "They came back," he said flatly. "The cartel. They tried to push me again, but I wasn't having it." Maggie's eyes searched his face, her gaze sharp and knowing. You didn't— I killed them, Jake interrupted. All of them. But it won't stop here. They'll come back, Maggie. They won't let it go. Maggie stood in silence for a long moment, her brow furrowed. She knew Jake well enough to understand that he wasn't the kind of man to make rash decisions. If he had killed them, it wasn't out of malice or recklessness. It was because there had been no other choice. But she also knew that the cartel would come after him with everything they had. You're right, Maggie said, her voice tight. They won't stop. But you need to think about the town, Jake. You need to think about the people who rely on this farm. The cartel doesn't just come for the farmers. They'll come for everyone. Jake nodded, his eyes steady. I know, but I can't let them take this, not after everything. Maggie walked closer, her expression softening slightly. She placed a hand on his shoulder, the weight of it a silent reminder of the years they had known each other. You've already risked everything to keep this place safe, but there's more at stake now. The cartel doesn't operate by rules. If they want revenge, they'll make sure they get it, even if it means hurting the people you love. Jake didn't respond at first, his thoughts drifting to the town. Oak Ridge was a small place full of good people who had no business being involved in this mess, but the cartel didn't care about that. They didn't care about who got caught in the crossfire. They only cared about control, and Jake had just made it clear that he wasn't going to hand it over without a fight. I can handle them, Maggie, Jake said finally. I've fought wars, been in places worse than this, but I'm not going to do it alone. I need help. Maggie's eyes searched his face, her brows knitting together in thought. She was a sheriff, but she wasn't a soldier. She had seen crime, had dealt with it in her own way, but this was different. The cartel was organized, ruthless. They had power that went beyond what any local law enforcement could handle. But Jake wasn't asking for a full-on fight with the law. He was asking for something more personal, help. It was something that, for all his training, he had never truly allowed himself to ask for. But it was the only way to win. You've got it, Maggie said after a long pause, her voice soft but firm. Whatever you need. Jake stood and walked to the window, staring out at the farm. The world was quiet, peaceful even, but it was a false peace, the calm before the storm. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The cartel wasn't done. They would come for him again. But this time, he wouldn't face them alone. I'm going to take the fight to them, Maggie, Jake said, his voice low but full of determination. But I need to make sure that when they come, they know they've met their match. Maggie nodded, her hand still resting on his shoulder. We'll make sure they don't win. As the two of them stood in the quiet of the farmhouse, Jake could feel the weight of the coming battle settling in. But it wasn't the first time he had fought for his life, and it wouldn't be the last. This time, however, the fight wouldn't just be his. It would be the town's fight, too. And they were going to make damn sure the cartel knew they had no place here. The days after the cartel's attack were filled with tension. Oak Ridge, once a sleepy town tucked away from the world's dangers, was now on edge. Jake and Maggie worked together, contacting a few trusted friends in the sheriff's department who knew about the cartel's presence. They couldn't rely on the law alone. The cartel had too many resources, too many connections. This was a war on their turf, and they needed to fight back with everything they had. Jake spent his days preparing the farm, laying out traps, setting up defensive positions around his land, and ensuring that every corner of his property was fortified. He even went as far as to set up a few hidden caches of weapons, just in case things went south. It wasn't just about protecting his farm anymore. It was about protecting everything he had built here, his past, his home, his future. The cartel might have thought they could control everything, but Jake wasn't about to let them take it without a fight. By the end of the week, he had gathered a small group of people who were willing to stand with him. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The farmers, the shopkeepers, and even a few veterans who had lived through their own wars. They were ready to fight, and more importantly, they were ready to defend their town. The night of the attack came quickly. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jake felt his pulse steady with each step. He knew the cartel would come in full force, and that they'd bring everything they had. It was a matter of survival now. They would either take Oak Ridge or die trying. Maggie arrived at the farm just before sunset, her face grim, but there was something in her eyes, a fire that hadn't been there before. She had a plan. Jake had trained for the worst, but now he needed to trust that Maggie and their small group could hold the line when the cartel came. "We're ready," Maggie said, looking over the maps Jake had drawn up. "The team is in position. We'll take out their vehicles first and give you a clean shot if they try to move in from the north." Jake nodded, tightening his grip on his rifle. He glanced around at the others, people who had been civilians just days ago, now hardened and ready to fight. "We've got to make sure they know we're not afraid," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't just about survival. It's about sending a message that Oak Ridge belongs to us." The hours crawled by as the sun dipped below the horizon and the town lay in wait. Jake moved silently through the shadows, positioning himself near the highest point on his farm, his rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. The wind had picked up, a faint rustling in the trees as the first signs of movement appeared. A truck, headlights cutting through the darkness, was slowly making its way down the road toward the farm. Jake's breath slowed, his eyes focused. They were here. Through the scope, he could see the silhouette of the SUV, the same black vehicle from earlier in the week, pulling up to the edge of the farm. Jake's finger hovered over the trigger. He could take out the driver, could silence the vehicle before the rest of them got out. But he wasn't going to take the shot just yet. He needed to wait. Timing was everything. Maggie's voice crackled through his earpiece. "They're here, Jake. We've got movement on the west side. They've split up into 2 groups." Jake's muscles tensed. The first wave of cartel soldiers was moving in, spreading out across the field. But they weren't expecting to be met with resistance. Jake watched as the group split, moving cautiously toward the house. He could almost hear their footsteps crunching in the grass, their shadows cutting through the darkness like predators. Now, Jake squeezed the trigger, the shot ringing out, clean and silent, hitting the first cartel member square in the chest. The body dropped to the ground before the rest of the men even realized what was happening. The chaos erupted immediately. Gunshots echoed through the fields, the crack of bullets breaking the stillness of the night. Jake's rifle barked again, another cartel member falling to the ground with a heavy thud. From his perch, Jake could see the panic setting in among the men. They had expected an easy victory. Now, they were surrounded on all sides, their plans falling apart. Maggie's voice again, sharp and commanding. "They're pulling back! Move in now, Jake! We've got them on the run!" Jake didn't hesitate. He slid down from his vantage point, running toward the action. The small team he had rallied was pushing forward, taking out the cartel members who were trying to regroup. The men had no idea who they were up against. They had thought they were dealing with farmers, with small-town civilians. But they were wrong. The sounds of gunfire grew louder, closer, as Jake moved through the chaos, directing the group with the precision of a man who had done this before. His shots were quick and clean, taking down one man after another, never giving them a chance to retaliate. The cartel's numbers were dwindling fast. Every step they took into Oak Ridge was met with resistance, every turn leading them into more trouble. But Rico, he was still out there. Jake knew the leader wouldn't go down so easily. He had probably already regrouped with the last few of his men, planning some desperate final push. Jake reached the front of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Rico. He could see one of the last cartel vehicles speeding away from the farm. Rico was trying to escape. Not this time. Jake raised his rifle, the scope aligning perfectly with the silhouette of the driver. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and the vehicle jerked to a halt, the driver slumping forward, lifeless. But it wasn't over. Rico was still on the move. Jake sprinted toward the trees where Rico and the remaining men had disappeared. He knew this had to end tonight. If they let Rico escape, he would just regroup and come back stronger. This town had fought too hard to let that happen. As Jake approached, he saw the shadow of Rico ducking behind a tree. He had no more men left. He was alone. Jake's voice carried across the field, calm, like he was speaking to an old friend. "It's over, Rico. You can't run anymore." Rico's eyes flashed with desperation as he turned to face Jake, his gun trembling in his hands. "You think you've won, old man?" He spat, his voice full of venom. "You're just delaying the inevitable." Jake took a slow step forward, his rifle steady. "There's nothing inevitable about it. You made the wrong move, and now you pay the price." The final shot was quiet. Rico's body crumpled to the ground, his weapon falling from his grasp. Jake stood over him for a moment, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. It was over, for now. Jake turned and walked back to the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the quiet landscape of Oak Ridge. The people of this town had come together, they had stood their ground, and they had won.